Hi, welcome to season 6, episode 3 of our podcast and video series about ROI, or what we call return on investment, or ROI. I'm Mary Abazia, Tom Spitali, and Sean Wellham. We're all with Impact Planning Group. And today we're really going to focus a bit more on the time frame of ROI. And the reason is if you think about Saturn, General Motors had launched a very successful product campaign, and a couple of years in, all of a sudden they said, you now have to be more, you have to return on our investment more quickly. So they pretty much killed something because they were short-sighted in their time frame. So the question is, how do I have my company help focus in on a time frame, especially when everything is so short-term driven? So who wants to take this one?
Wow, this is a volunteer. So I volunteered Tom to take it, if that's
okay. Tom, you go.
All right, I do have some thoughts on it, actually.
Okay.
I think it's marketing's responsibility to kind of proactively shift this dialogue a little bit. And I think there's a specific way that they can do that. I think this concept of lifetime value of a customer is something that is a little bit to a lot underrated in B2B. When we think about a short-term return on investment, we tend to think about, in the time period measured, did we bring enough revenue to cover the costs? And it's a good discipline, but there's got to be a more broader thought process there, because every time you bring on a new customer, if your company has got a fundamentally sound product and good service, what you're hoping is that initial sale isn't all, that there's a lifetime quote of revenue that comes behind that initial buy. And it's worth it for marketers to both measure that and try to figure out, every time we bring on a new customer, how long do they stay with us? How often do they buy? To start to understand both long-term returns and educating the business that we shouldn't be so short-term focused. But also to begin to understand, what can you spend to bring on a customer? Right. And if a funny thing will happen too, if you start thinking that way, I think the business automatically stops having such a short-term mentality about serving customers. They start to think about, what else can we sell them? How can we be nicer to them, so that they want to keep doing business with us. So I think that it's up to marketing to begin to lead this charge around lifetime value, if it isn't something that's being measured at your company, and it can help to take that pressure off that short-term return on investment mentality that a lot of companies have.
No, I totally agree with the lifetime value, and broaden that concept out to understand the value not only in onward and future purchases, but also in referrals, and in the general sense that the more people that are using your product, the more mainstream it becomes. So you've got that sort of networking effect with lifetime value as well. I think the other thing to look at, in addition to that, is the sort of brand value. We think of brand as very much a consumer proposition. Generally speaking, we associate brands with the stuff we see on the supermarket shelves. But every business has got a brand. And while the consumer companies spend a fortune on brand awareness with measurements like brand recognition and brand recall, start to factor that in, because these are leading indicators of the return on your marketing investment. If you, and I don't care if you're in the plant hire business, or you're selling forklift trucks, or you're selling axle grease, it doesn't matter. If your particular brand is on the mind of your target customer and is associated with the positioning that you've taken, whatever that is the gift that keeps giving. It's the sustainability aspect. You can do short-term promotions all day long and get results, which is the risk of focusing on short-term ROI measures, is always saying this campaign cost this and it gave us this. Make sure that we're also building those leading indicators, that enough of your target population is aware of you, hopefully can recall your brand unaided, at the very least can recognize your brand when presented with it, and you've become top of mind. Those are things that have huge long-term value, but don't show up in the short-term metrics so much. It's a race without an end. There's no finish line to marketing. It's ongoing.
Yeah, it isn't one of the more sexy parts of marketing when you talk about this, but it is one of the more powerful parts of it. And I think getting people to align around what those expectations are with the return on investment is critical. I mean, if you think about Kodak, they were dripping in money with film. And so if anyone came to them with, well, they said, hey, we got this digital thing. And if you look at the numbers, if you looked at the return on investments, it was obvious that they would say, it's clearly not meeting our high expectations that we have on film. So why would we ever think about doing this? And so I think there is a really good bad case of looking back and saying, you have to project out and have a different set of expectations for different scenarios perhaps, or different worlds, because there would be no reason to go to digital camera if you just focused in on how high your return on investment was with the film. So,
well, I think that story is really powerful, and trying to bridge together what you're saying, Mary, with what Sean is saying about brand measures and brand equity. The building brand is important. It's important to try to come up with that metric, whether it's net promoter score or some kind of measure of how what you're doing recently is impacting positively or negatively your brand equity. Again, consumer brands do a lot of this, and B2B brands really don't do enough. But in a case like Kodak, even though the returns, on an innovative pathway were less than their traditional business, I think that if they had their finger on the pulse of how customers are feeling about some of these innovative new pathways, and if we go down this path, is this going to positively or negatively impact our brand? They probably would have seen that customers were interested in these innovative new things, and it probably would have increased their brand equity. So bringing that into consideration, typically not measured in that short-term return on investment.
I have to say, I almost agree with you, but not quite. Just because in my Bases days, we were watching these new technologies come about, and there's a very small group that's like, oh, this is the right next thing, and they were excited about it. But there were so many people that held on to the old, film, because they too, if you measured their typical customers, they didn't want the change. There was a small group, and as we know, as over time that there's a migration and more people accept that change. But it really is, you have to go and look at those cutting edge or bleeding edge to measure what they see as potential excitement, to be able to say, yes, we need to put our money in this area and have a different expectation on our return on investment than what our core business is. So you kind of set aside two buckets of expectations, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's important too. Yeah, Mary, that's a great point. You're right. You got me to reconsider what I just said. So good job. So, but I do think that it brings into play, so how do you innovate? How do you know if an innovation is going to be successful when large swaths of your, traditional base might say, no, I don't want that, or I don't get it. And I think it's important to have something that we've talked about on other calls here, other podcasts, where you have to have a trend discipline. And it's the tricky part of actually trying to put yourself into the shoes of how your customers are going to feel in the future world.
Yes.
Certain trends happen, and try to get a sense for how they're going to change before maybe they even do. Makes innovation really tricky. But if you don't do this, then you end up like Kodak.
Sean, what do you think about Tom's point about the innovation, and how do you frame that within?
It's you've got to take a long-term view. with innovation. You've got to be looking at how the market's going to be in the future. That probably goes without saying, but sometimes the full benefit of those innovations take a while to throw off the sort of returns that might get you excited today. So there's a little bit of hedging your bets involved in innovation. We can all look over the horizon and try and guess where the market might be going, what technologies might be coming, what some pioneers are currently doing. But it is the most difficult thing for most businesses to do, because once you're established in your market, it's all about efficiency. You know, it's getting that product to market. It's all about getting that reputation for reliability. It's all about having a degree of certainty. Innovation is always disruptive to some extent, and you end up having to disrupt yourself. We've talked about this before, about this destroy your own business mindset. And I think when you look at it that way, I think it helps, because if you're always protecting the here and now, most people would accept logically that's a very short-term thing. That's not going to give you long-term success, because things will change. So when you look at innovation, you've got to look at it not only in terms of the short-term returns, you've got to look at the long-term, and to factor that, you've got to figure out how the current situation will change. If you're no longer getting these massive returns on this current product because of disruption, that's not the benchmark anymore. The benchmark is what the future will be like. So it's really, really tough. But if you're not looking over that horizon, you can't stand still. You know, that's the thing. Not only is a race without a finish line, if you stop, you'll never catch up again. You know,
my favorite example of that, Sean, is one of our medical device companies was very successful, and a guy over in the legal group said, I think we're getting way too comfortable. And he kind of called a mandate. He said, I want to have a disruption session. And they got some very young thinkers in the company and old thinkers in the company, and got them together and had them really explore different industries to say, what if some of these technologies, how do we think about the future of our world very different than today? We may not even exist in 10 years. How do we think different about it? And then they got customers' reaction to it, not just any customer, but customers that were more forward thinking to weigh in and go, And I think then they went back and looked at some models, some mathematical models, to say, which of these then should we at least put some of our energy against, with a very different expectation of what might happen in the future. And, you know, we look back and some people say, I can't believe that the legal guy did that. But thank goodness that he did. And he got, you know, over 30 people in the company to weigh in and make some pretty big claims, which a couple they're actually pursuing now. So it is possible for other, you know, marketing doesn't have to carry this on its own. You can have finance be your friend, or legal, and make sure that they're a part of this big question.
So what you say, Mary, when in doubt, ask a lawyer. I think that's the takeaway.
At least have a lawyer as a friend. Yes.
Yeah, so that's generally good advice for life anyway, I think.
Tom?
Probably. Well, I think it brings it into the whole discussion about innovation and ROI is super interesting, because even, let's take that situation, Mary, you know, that we experienced together with the lawyer, and some really, really great ideas that came out of that session that he called. Frankly, probably most of those ideas will fail. Some of them will probably be the future of the company. Some of them will save the company. But how do you know, from a return on investment standpoint, you know, I think it's an interesting question how you navigate through those failures. Because if you're just strictly looking for winners, you may never attempt some of the innovative ideas that you need to try. You know, so what do you do? I mean, how do you navigate through that, and how do you fail from an ROI standpoint and live to tell about it?
Well, yeah, you know, I think there's a couple of big bear traps here that I've come across. I used to have a boss that whenever we were starting a project, he would say, if you're going to go ugly early. That was his famous phrase, which was, if this isn't going to work, let's find out soonest. And that's pretty good advice. But I think it's wrong-headed, because I often hear people use this little phrase of fail early, fail often. You know, historically, failure is not okay. We like success. We don't like failure. People avoid it. And that conventionally means we're not taking sufficient risk. We're not being sufficiently innovative. And the conventional wisdom is therefore take more risks. But that has to come with it's okay to fail. Now, where I think this goes wrong is we shouldn't be encouraging people to fail often and fail early. We should be encouraging people to experiment and learn and iterate. Because I think failure to me sounds too much like it's the end of the road. But often in the ashes of a project that didn't go as maybe you intended, there are parts of it that can feed into the next generation. So I always try and encourage people to say, don't think of failing as and succeeding as a binary choice, because in reality, you will succeed over time by having these minor course corrections along the way. I don't like to think of them as failures as much as it goes back to that Edison thing, isn't it? Of I never failed. I just found 9,000 ways not to make a light bulb. That sort of attitude of saying we now learned something we can take forward. So my advice to people is don't think of it as failing. Don't try to fail, and certainly don't try and do it often, but accept that it will happen, but it is a process of iteration and learning and reapplication. So
well, yeah, I'm with you on this, John, but I think that there has to be the numbers part of that. It's what is failure is part of that question. And, when we're going to fail, is it because we couldn't make the product or the service, or is it that the numbers, no matter how we looked at it, didn't work? And that's what we're hoping is that as people experiment, there's a calculator nearby that they're always, even if it's a very low ROI in the beginning, they can show the upside in Horizon 2 or Horizon 3, so that it's not an immediate failure, but more, if we keep doing this, as you're saying, iterating, our ROI will get better, or we can adjust these things so that we can improve our margins on this.
And I think that's really true. And I probably should emphasize that when I say don't think about failing, think of it as a learning opportunity. That sounds a little bit trite. And in reality, you sometimes will make a horrendous failure where there is nothing to be gained other than the lesson not to do that ever again, or to maybe think, what could we have done to have understood that was going to fail? So yes, you will get horrendous failures occasionally. That comes with the territory of experimenting. But make sure, and I agree, you've got to have that iterative, curious mindset. And the numbers are important. You can't just keep spinning your wheels until something happens. We're not scientists. I guess that's the preserve of people who can just think up things on a whim. We have to have at least a structure of why we're doing something and what we anticipate happening. And that's where the numbers come in clearly.
Well, I think it's even broader than the numbers. I think it's an experimental discipline that you've got to have. I think that marketing can take the lead on this in certain situations, certain companies where you're positioned, where there's not enough experimentation going on. I think, if marketing can set out, that kind of experimental discipline. What are we going to measure? What are the variables here? What are we going to test? And what's potentially, the next stage after we learn from this? The business can start to get an understanding that if we do indeed fall short here, we know where we're going to go next, what we're going to try next, and that we're going, and maybe if a lesson comes from somewhere besides our variables, we're going to learn that as well. And taking it even further, marketing needs to be buttoned up on the experimental design, if you will, of what they want to test. I think it needs to be presented as a portfolio. In other words, there's a portfolio of things going on here. Some of them are experimental, but they're not the majority of what we're doing. The majority of what we're doing is we're trying to, 80% of what we're doing is basically, not what we would call experimental. 20% of what we're doing, or 20% of our budget, or 10% of our budget is truly experimental. But this could lead to the big things that, that float our business's boat in the future. I think just all that communication is really important to get the company to shift to have a little bit more of an experimental mindset.
And we should also say, I know it's it's not that common. But the serendipity that when things just happen, you know, that some failures can actually spark a bigger success. That the precursor of Viagra failed as a blood pressure medication, right? So, you know, you've also got to say, when you are experimenting and pushing boundaries, what you learn isn't always, oh, we got that a little bit wrong, we can make it a little bit better. Sometimes you kick open a whole new door that goes, wow, hang on a minute, we've just stumbled into something, because we're always pushing forward. And I think that should always be taken into account. I think you'd be a brave person to ask for a massive research budget on the off chance that you discover a blockbuster. But remember that that is consequence of experimenting. Failure can sometimes lead to a success way in excess of what you were planning originally. So always be optimistic and curious.
Love it. Wow. Well, we hope that you have heard or seen a couple of things here that will give you some ideas about what you might try in your own business. You can find all our podcasts on the Accidental Marketer site. And then also we have, of course, on YouTube and on SoundCloud, we have our podcasts. So please let us know if you have any thoughts on anything that we share with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.